Okay, good afternoon. My name is Hugo Lagercrantz and I am editor-in-chief of Acta Paediatrica, and we are, which is, belongs to, in some way, affiliated with the Barnläkarföreningen. So we are arranging a workshop for how to write a paper and how to review a paper, and I've invited Nick Brown from Archives Disease Childhood. He's living in Gävle, and Ola Saugstad, who recently became editor-in-chief of Neonatology. But we're going to discuss how to write a paper and how to review a paper. But what's very important is that the paper is marketed and cited. And Jonas Ludvigsson, he's a specialist on that. He's very good to market his paper. I think we as scientists, we have to do that. I mean, we can't just hope that anyone will read our papers if we don't do anything. And now he will present his tricks. I also want to mention that we have a foundation at Astrid Lindgren Children's Hospital, Barnforskning vid Astrid Lindgrens barnsjukhus, and we have a prize. And I got the privilege to select the winner of the prize. And the first winner was Ola Andersson from Halmstad. And then Marianne Thoresen from Oslo, and now it's Jonas Ludvigsson, and mainly because he's so good to spread the information or the science of pediatrics, not only to our colleagues but also to the general public, not at least parents. And I think we should learn a little from him. So I give you the word to you. I just want to mention that for those who don't know, Jonas is a professor in epidemiology at Karolinska Institutet, but also consultant at Örebro Hospital or University Regionsjukhus heter det, va? And he's adjunct professor at Columbia University. And he's also quite often interviewed in the Swedish press and media when there's a problem with children. And okay, I think I'll leave the word for you because I can mention much more. But
thank you very much, Hugo. Pleasure to be here in Halmstad. Also very happy to thank the Swedish Railway, SJ. Everything was on time. And we should be quite lucky about that. But first of all, I want to touch upon that shelf. I could have had a quite different career, actually. I don't say I could have imitated Per Gessle, but perhaps my first stage appearance of note was when I was about 10 years old, when I was giving a concert as part of school break, and the day before I was going to sing and play a song by Blowin' in the Wind by Bob Dylan, together with two of my 10-year-old friends, and our guitar teacher had told us that if you want to, for the last verse, there are 3 verses in Blowin' in the Wind, you can take off the guitar and just continue to sing while the others play in the background, you know. So we had this concert in church as part of school leave. So when the priest had declared summer is here, I and my friends, we were invited up on stage and we were giving this concert. The night before, I'd seen a television program about not really Black Lives Matter, but something similar about Black people's movement in the United States. So I was very inspired by that. I'd seen, the gestures and freedom and stuff like that. So by the end of the song, I took off my guitar and I ended the concert singing and standing on one knee, like this, for the freedom of all people in the world. And I have to say the cheering that I experienced in church that day, I've never come close to anything like that ever since. So that was a bit of my connection to Per Gessle. Now over to the topic of today, how to publish a paper that is cited 1,000 times, or rather, how to write a paper that is cited at least 100 times. That will be the topic of my talk. In short, I'm a pediatrician and an epidemiologist. I have 3 boys. They're called Hannes, Elias, and Joseph. We tend to abbreviate that HEY to keep track of them. I like books, international newspapers, and biking, but most of all, I'm a football coach. I also think that before I start, I think it's important to point out that I spend a lot of time in the clinics. I think that's important for my background as a researcher and for the things I publish. I also spend almost as much time on the trains as I do in the clinics. I commute very, very much. So traveling from Örebro and to Halmstad back and forth in one day is just my average daily commute, actually. I have some disclosures. I have received some funding from a number of big pharma. I also have published a book about the diseases and death of Harry Potter. And whenever you buy that book on Amazon, I earn about 10 cents. Currently, there are only 1.7 million books at Amazon selling better than my book. So, I think the first thing we have to disentangle or to discuss when you say how do you write a paper cited 1,000 or 100 times is cited by whom. And there are various ways of keeping track of citations. The most common one is by Web of Science. Web of Science is quite restrictive in how they count citations, so it's more difficult actually to attain 1,000 citations on Web of Science than, for instance, on Google Scholar, which is much more generous. So I'm not going to focus much on my papers being cited 1,000 times. I will mention them, but I will focus more on the 45 papers I have cited at least 100 times, because it's easier to find any pattern among these 45 patients than among the 4 papers I have cited 1,000 times. But if instead we look at Google Scholar, I have 93 papers cited 100 times. So obviously Google Scholar is much more generous when it comes to citations. And that is, I just mentioned that people have a tendency to only mention their citations by Google Scholar because that increases both their number of citations and their H index. But shortly, the title was "How do you publish a paper being cited 1,000 times?" And here are 4 such papers. Well, my 4 papers cited at least 1,000 times, and they say something about highly cited papers. The first paper is a paper about research infrastructure, about the Swedish patient register. And I wrote that in response to a request, you could say, from the NIH, the American funding agency NIH, where I apply for money. And they said, they had actually 2 questions. What is the patient register? And what is the personal identity number? Which you're going to use to link these registers. And you claim that is a huge advantage for research, for being able to link these big population-based registers. But you can't describe, there's no description of the patient register. There's actually no description of the patient identity number, which is your personal identity number, personnumret, that you refer to. So I wrote these 2 papers in response to that NIH review request, and they became 2 of my most cited papers. Very often used by other epidemiologists, obviously. The third paper is the COVID-19 paper, which I published in Acta Paediatrica, showing that children typically have a rather mild COVID-19. And the 4th paper is a paper I call the Oslo paper. That was a consensus paper where I gathered around 20 researchers from 10 different countries, and we agreed on definitions for celiac disease. How do you define celiac disease to make sure that we speak about the same thing? When we say celiac disease, when we say villus atrophy, when we say we discuss concepts in celiac disease. That paper goes under the name the Oslo paper because I wrote the first outline of the paper at a hotel in Oslo. But if I'm going to focus instead on papers cited 100 times, which I think is more interesting because it's easy to say something about these papers, it's easy to find some kind of pattern. They can be grouped in several different ways, and of these 45 papers, most of them are just, well, they're ordinary research papers which have answered an important question or made an impact in the field. And it could be something like celiac disease and the risk of death, or it could be pregnancy outcome in women with IBD or with celiac disease, a typical research paper. But then there are some papers who fall into specific categories, and these are the ones I put in this graph here. And the first are papers about healthcare registers. Papers about healthcare registers are typically cited very often, because when people use these registers, they want to refer back to something and say, this is the register we used, this is these are the variables of the register, this is its history, its quality, its validity, etc., etc. So I've written a number of papers on registers in Sweden. Most of them highly cited, actually, some of them not cited. I've also written quite a few papers on validation. Most of them are not highly cited, but some of them are. And a validation is typically, you find there is a disorder that you're interested in and that you want to examine, and you want to know, how sure can I be that the definition I'm using for this condition is good? Let's say, for instance, I want to study type 1 diabetes in the national registers, and I say I retrieve every patient with the code E10, which is type 1 diabetes. And then I want to say to a reader that when a patient has E10, I can be sure this patient has type 1 diabetes. But what about if a patient is cared for in the child psychiatry department, and the previous two codes this patient has had is F10, alcohol intoxication, then he has one E10, and then he has another F10, then he has another two F10. So he has alcohol intoxication, type 1 diabetes, and then alcohol intoxication. Clearly that E10 is just a typo. It's incorrect. This patient doesn't have type 1 diabetes. And these kind of errors occur when humans handle data. So writing a validation paper, typically you request 200 or 300 patient charts from a group of patients with a specific code. You go through them and you say, what percentage of these patients really have this diagnosis? How sure can I be they have these diagnoses? And some of these papers, they involve a lot of work, but sometimes they're highly cited by people who do research in this field. Typically interesting with these papers is they never make it into high-impact journals. There are no journals being interested in publishing these papers because they're not, sexy, but they often some of them become highly cited. Another category of papers which tend to be highly cited are papers on incidence or prevalence. To some people that's not, very exciting. How common is a disease, or how many new patients do we have each year with a certain disease? But it has a merit to know that, because when people write their introduction, they tend to write their introduction this way. Type 1 diabetes is severe disease. It's characterized by having blah 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 blah, beta cells blah 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 blah, high blood glucose, and it occurs in 1 of 400 people. There are so many people who want to say, how common is it? So if you write a paper showing very clearly how common is a disease or how many people get this disease, you're fairly likely to get cited. Yeah. The reason I perform incidence and prevalence studies are actually not to become highly cited, but is because I want my PhD students to learn the concepts incidence and prevalence. And there's one good way of learning that, and that is to write a paper on incidence and prevalence and get to know the underlying statistics for that. But often that paper is their most cited. Another kind of paper which tends to become highly cited are, of course, guidelines. If you are part of guideline committees, expert groups, etc., and you publish a paper, this paper is cited because it's probably worth being cited, but also because the other people on being co-authoring this paper are also very often active researchers, likely to cite their own papers. So it's going to be published. Finally, well, not finally, but almost, some reviews on meta-analysis are highly cited. I have 3 meta-analyses with citations more than 100. In my case, they're usually about how common is celiac disease in thyroid disease, how common is it in type 1 diabetes, how common is this in other disorders. And this actually is important because it determines whether it's worth screening patients with type 1 diabetes or thyroid disease or something else for celiac disease. Finally, I have 4 papers with more than 100 citations where I would say they tie into some kind of news. And in this case, most prominently, that is, these are papers about COVID-19, for instance. It's a very highly, hotly debated topic of huge societal importance right now, where I write a paper which is very timely. I'm the first writing the paper. There's not been a similar paper before. Everyone's interested, and it's something occurring right now. And I had actually thought, looking back up the paper I wrote a year ago about the health of Ukrainian children, refugee children, would be such a paper, because it was actually mentioned in an editorial in the Lancet as a paper they thought was very, very timely and needed, and still that has not really made an impact on the scientific community, so it hasn't been cited that much, but I thought it would. Another way of dividing these 45 papers, which are highly cited or cited at least 100 times, is what about the research field? What are they about? Not the category, but what are they about? And then you can see they're about, very many different things. So there's really nothing here in this second graph that will give you any clues on what will be highly cited. And they just reflect the kind of research I do. I do research on celiac disease, IBD, liver disease, pregnancy outcome, etc. And within each of these fields, I have a number of papers highly cited. But then, of course, I think this is what really decides whether a paper is highly cited or not. Is it an old paper? It has gathered many citations. If it's a new paper, it is not yet cited. So if you look at the 45 papers I have with at least 100 citations, only 4 of them have been published since 2020, because they have still not, they've still not been cited. So obviously, the older the paper, the greater the chance it's highly cited. So moving over to the news aspect, how do you publish a paper which is highly cited, which is has some kind of news value, like the COVID-19 papers, perhaps the Ukrainian health paper, perhaps the paper quite recently about hormonal treatment in gender dysphoria in young kids, which is a very much debated topic. And I think that apart from being careful, you have to be careful with the data. You have to be very, you have to do a good job, but you also have to be fast, extraordinarily fast. You have to be the first to publish in a field. Generally, you have a better chance to be highly cited then. And to be honest about the COVID-19 paper, which has been cited more than 1,000 times in Acta Paediatrica, I first sent it to the Lancet. The Lancet said there's not enough data in this field yet, and we're not sure yet whether COVID-19 will be a big thing or not. That's how early I was. We're not sure it's going to be a big thing yet, and there's not enough data. I thought there was enough data, and obviously Hugo agreed, and it became the first paper, I would say, about children and COVID-19. And of course, that's why it's cited more than 1,000 times. So I think it's actually more important when you have a news item or have a paper about something which is extremely hot, that you go for a journal with a quick handling of your manuscript rather than going for a high impact journal. Yeah, I would target a journal which I know this journal will get my paper out, published on PubMed within a month, rather than I'm trying for a high impact paper which could reject me many times, and I won't publish this paper within a year's time. Actually, I tried the other way with a paper I think was extremely good. It was the first paper on inflammatory bowel disease and COVID-19. And it was, I'm sure, the first paper comparing patients with IBD with controls without IBD, looking at COVID-19 risk. And we found a very small increased risk, much smaller than anticipated. I sent that paper to Gut, and I kind of know the editor a bit, Ahmed El-Omar, because I've published so much in Gut, and he wrote back to me and says, Jonas, I know you always write brilliant papers, and this is a great paper, but you're late on the ball. because similar things have been published before. I disagreed because there had only been papers about IBD patients, but not compared with general population controls. So I disagreed, but nevertheless, he's the man who makes the decision. So it was rejected, and it kept on being rejected, and it was only published more than 1 year after I first submitted to a journal. And of course, by then, many other people had published their paper on IBD and COVID-19. And looking back, if I'd want more citations, I should have gone for another journal than gut or gastroenterology to begin with. So what can you do to increase your chances of writing a paper which is highly cited? Well, first of all, you can write many papers. I mean, if you write many papers, sooner or later one of them, just by chance, will probably be highly cited. I'm not sure it's an approach I recommend, but it is true. There are papers I have with more than 100 citations where I did not imagine they would have more than 100 citations when we submitted them. Just by chance, they focus on something which becomes hot, or they have something which catch the attention of someone. The other thing I think is focusing on quality and not quantity, and this is of course opposing to my first line, so these contrasts. Very many of my papers that I now submit to journals and which are highly cited tend to have like 10 e-tables, 10 extra tables, 10 extra figures. The amount of data that goes into these papers are generally more than one dissertation. They have, we try to cover every aspect. I read a paper this morning which is a huge paper, where my co-authors carried out 9 sensitivity analysis. So there are at least 10 versions of every table, more or less. You can discuss that. You can clearly discuss that approach. But I see that very often. I see that coming. Another thing you can do is to identify the field that is hot, but a topic not yet reviewed. Like the paper we recently published in Acta Paediatrica, which I expect to become highly cited sooner, about hormonal treatment in gender dysphoria in young people. This is a very hot topic. There are very few review papers or even systematic reviews in this field, where we performed one as part of the SBU, the National Agency for something, Knowledge Evaluation Assessment, something, where I was on that committee. And then we decided to turn that report into a scientific paper. A good way of writing, of increasing your chances of writing a highly cited paper is, of course, becoming an expert in your field. If you become an expert, a world-class expert in your field, you will have better ideas because you will know the field better. You will know where the gaps of knowledge are, and you will often find good collaborators. And you will be invited to participate on exciting papers. Another thing I want to actually emphasize is sitting on committees, sitting in expert groups. Actually, sitting on committees and expert groups is often quite tedious. It takes a lot of time. I sometimes ask myself, is it worth it? I tend to sit on expert committees because I feel it's my duty to sit on expert committees, because someone's got to think through a topic and give some kind of recommendations to the general society or to the government or some kind of government association. But when you sit on this government committee for 2 or 3 years, you get a knowledge, or you start to grasp the field, and it often opens up for writing a review paper which is extremely well built. I think also you can increase your chances to get a highly cited paper by working with the best people in the world. And that may not be as difficult as it sounds. I have people contacting me regularly who wants to collaborate on fields where I do good stuff. And I don't always agree to collaborate because I don't have the time, but now and then I believe they have a good idea and I trust what they're doing. I actually try to check before because I don't want to be fooled into a collaboration which turns out to be scientific misconduct. But when I have checked that and I trust what they do, I sometimes collaborate with them, and I believe I do improve their papers. Similarly, I believe that if you were to collaborate with a world-class authority in your field, they're likely to improve your paper. One kind of paper which tends to be highly cited is also papers that change guidelines. Either there is a lack of knowledge in a field, like for instance, I've been focusing lately on IBD and pregnancy. When you read the guidelines about IBD and pregnancy, there is, for instance, very little knowledge about disease activity and pregnancy outcome. There's just IBD, okay, it's bad for pregnancy outcome, or it will have this impact, but there's very little about, okay, disease activity. Does it matter if we moderate, if we decrease disease activity, if we in some way have an impact on that? And how can I study that? So I try to find a topic where guidelines have not been able to identify or answer a certain question. And then we try to answer that question. There are finally other ways to become highly cited if you have something other people want to collaborate on. Yeah, but what about the actual writing? I mean, there are also things you can do yourself to increase your chances of having paper which is highly cited. I think the first thing is having a good grasp of the literature. You should know the literature. You should be fair when you cite the literature. You should not, omit references which are contradictory or which does not support your findings. You should show, I'm on top of the literature. Especially since the people who tend to review your papers are other people in the field, and they will be annoyed if they're not cited. And then how do I write it? Well, I think people have various ways of writing papers. Myself, I guess I've written many papers, so I tend to write them from the beginning to the end. But I know very many people who start from the results section. I know other people who start by the method section, etc. So you can do it various ways. I try to be very careful with spelling and grammar. I find it very annoying when I review papers and I see incorrect spelling, or I see substantial grammatical errors. I feel, how does that, if you don't care more about spelling, how much do you then care about your results or your experiments or something? It's just something I think about the personality. So finally, just, to exemplify, I'll go through just a few of my highly cited papers so that you can see more in detail what were they about. And here I have used Google Scholar, and that's not because to show the higher number of citations, but it was easy to make screenshots from Google Scholar than from ISI. So the first one is this, which according to Google Scholar has been cited 4,000 times instead of 2,000 times, according to Web of Science, ISI. But you can see the first one is a paper about registers. The second one is this paper in Acta Paediatrica about COVID-19 in children, which showed a milder disease course and better prognosis. The third one is about the personal identity number, and then comes this paper on celiac disease, which I call the Oslo paper. And these I've already mentioned. The other ones also belong to some of these groups I've just recently mentioned, like the next paper is a guideline paper, where I was asked to take the lead in actually the British Society of Gastroenterology when they published their guideline on celiac disease, which has been cited like 1,000 times. And the next time is a register-based paper. The next paper is also about a Swedish register, and this time the cause of death register. The prevalence of celiac disease in the United States, I think this illustrates very well this incidence and prevalence category. This might have been one of the first papers published in the United States about the prevalence of celiac disease. There's now huge interest for celiac disease in the United States. There's just as many people in the States who eat a gluten-free diet as there is in Sweden, for good or bad reasons. So there's a strong interest, and this being the first paper, perhaps it's cited all the time. And then I have a paper about a database, which is about data on socioeconomy in Sweden, very often used in register-based research. And finally, a more traditional paper published in JAM about mortality in celiac disease, which was back then clearly the largest paper on celiac disease, and we'd used quite interesting methodology to look at mortality of a quite common disease. So it's been cited by many celiac disease papers. The next paper here is more like we were the first to show something. And the top paper here was the first to show an association between a drug, an ACE inhibitor, and villus atrophy, which has since become common knowledge, at least among gastroenterologists, that if you find villus atrophy in someone with an ACE inhibitor, that is most likely not celiac disease. That is most likely a complication from use of that drug. But we were the first to show that in 22. It's kind of a patient report of 22 patients at the Mayo Clinic. The next one is about reviews, but the next one after that is quite interesting, because that is one of the papers that I never thought would become highly cited. There's been this talk about the gut-brain axis. It's quite, a popular concept, that there's something between the gut and the brain. And there had been this discussion that Parkinson's disease in some way could start down here at, in the gut, and then migrate in some way through the vagal nerve or some way. No one really knew how it could migrate, but it could in a way move that way up here to the brain. And then I suggested to a research group doing research in Parkinson, we should be able to look at people with vagotomy, because you simply, you clip the nerve, and then if that has any impact, then you should have less Parkinson. And it turns out you have less Parkinson, which is extremely interesting, of course. And our paper was the first paper in that field looking at vagotomy and Parkinson, and in a way, added some kind of support to the hypothesis of gut-brain axis. So it's being cited all the time. And then we have a number of, then I have a review paper, the celiac disease and non-celiac gluten sensitivity in the BMJ, another paper on research infrastructure, the ethics of register-based research, and then another paper on incidence, again. So here is, again, incidence in the United States of celiac disease. And then I have a couple of COVID papers. And then moving on, the top paper here is also about COVID, and that's my third paper in Acta Paediatrica, which is highly cited about COVID-19. One about COVID-19 in general in children, the second about children's role of transmission of COVID-19, and the third one about Sweden's COVID-19 strategy, which was quite debated worldwide in the beginning. And I wrote a review paper to show what was that like. And then for the rest, you see usually papers in different fields, but in celiac disease, IBD, liver disease, etc., where the findings are of some kind of importance. Then I also think that getting many citations, the first condition for getting many citations is getting your paper published at all. And to get your paper published at all, at least you need a review from peer reviewers. And I know editors very often reject papers immediately, and they don't send it out for review. I fully understand that. I do that as well. So I suggest to anyone who wants to get a highly cited paper, begin by having your paper sent out for peer review at all. And then you need to read the instructions to authors to begin with. I try to address the editor by name to show that I've read the author's instructions and I've checked the website. I try to include mandatory statements in my letter to the editor. Also to show I've read the instructions to authors. I've tried to format this paper according to your will. I tend to write quite short letters to the editors, especially since I once had a long discussion with the editor of Gastroenterology who told me, no, I actually never read the letters to the editor. I throw them away. I just have a quick look at the abstract. But I imagine editors very often have a lack of time and don't want to read essays. You can correct me. So therefore, I try to write extremely short letters to the editors. I try to stress how my paper will change clinical practice, if it does, because then it has a clinical impact. And finally, I tend to attach a research checklist if it is relevant. So if it is relevant, I always attach the consort checklist or a stroke checklist to show at least I did this. I try to be careful when I write and when I submit. And with that, I'd like to thank you for listening, and I open up for questions. Thank you.
So welcome to this afternoon session, and it's about promotion. It's about pediatric writing, pediatric scientific papers, and also get them published. And I will introduce, say a few introductory words, and then we have a publisher from Wiley, Tatum, and she will talk about open access. And then Nick Brown, who is chief editor of Archives. This is childhood, but lives in Gävle, works in Sweden. And he will also we will also present the journals and how we treat manuscripts, etc. And then Ola Saugstad, who is a newly appointed chief editor of Neonatology. You can wonder why you are my Acta's competitors, but but I think it's much better to collaborate. And my take-home message is that I think as pediatricians we should publish in pediatric journals and in any pediatric journals. I understand that you want to publish in New England Journal of Medicine and Lancet. That's okay, or sell, but I don't really understand why some pediatricians, they send the papers to journals like Allergy or Diabetes or adult journals, which I don't think are so much better than pediatric research, but they have a higher impact factors. And the problem for us is that all pediatric journals have low impact factors except JAMA Pediatrics. Oh yes, but it's a news I did. Yeah. But it's very short paper. There are just few reviews.
You come for a denominator.
Yes, yes. Okay. But I like this Nobel Prize laureate Randy Sheckman, who he said the tyranny of the impact factor, the pressure to publish flashy research in glitzy journals. So he has opened an own journal, E-Life, which is very good. Has actually a high impact factor, but I think we have to be a little careful about the papers which are quoted, cited a lot. Not of course your paper, but I usually take this example I got from George Lister, who was editor-in-chief of Paediatric Research with I was European editor, and this is a little old slide, but these are 6 articles in New England Journal of Medicine about sudden infant death syndrome, and there are theories and ideas how they die, and none of them is true. It hasn't been possible to repeat them, maybe one or some. So I show this for students, but since it's published in New England Journal of Medicine, I don't know the impact factor, maybe it's 100. It must be true. Isn't it true? No. And this illustrates what you talked about a few years ago. Sudden infant death syndrome was a very common. There were a lot of articles and new ideas published all the time. It was very easy to get them published, and most of them were wrong. And there's a Ioannidis, he has written interesting papers why current publications may distort science, and this is a very busy slide, but the idea is that you review mainly, you refer mainly to reviews and established facts, and if someone comes with a new idea which doesn't fit in with the general consensus, it's very much more difficult to get published. And there's a certain hierarchy of medical science. Actually, this goes back to Plato. I mean, philosophy and metaphysics was very highly ranked, while medicine was very lowly ranked already at that time. But as you know, I don't know, stem cell research is a little controversial now. I think now it's very popular is, of course, artificial intelligence. But otherwise it's molecular biology and nanomedicine. These journals have very high impact factors. And somewhere in the bottom, pediatrics, and nursing and breastfeeding. So it's best to be on at the molecular level and more holistic views are not so rewarding. I was a member of the Assembly Nobel Committee for many years before I retired, and we refer very seldom to that this candidate has 10 papers in Nature or something. That wasn't so important. So we really try to see what the message in the paper, what's new. I think one example, which I think is very, you are familiar certainly with it, but I think it's quite good. And that's Barry Marshall and Robin Warren, who got the Nobel Prize for discovery of Helicobacter. And Robin Warren, he was a pathologist in the basement. He was a little odd person, very strange ideas. He said that he saw some microbes in the ventricle, in the gastric ventricle, but everyone said, no, it's acetic acid, it's not possible. And they couldn't, and Robin Warren was just a young doctor, and he needed to have a scientific paper to get promoted. He was not very interested in research in general. He liked to go out in the pub to drink beers. But anyway, he to demonstrate that this could be in pathogenetic factors, Barry Marshall swallowed some. It was difficult to cultivate this Helicobacter, and but he managed to get some kind of solution with Helicobacter and swallowed it, and he got very sick. And then he also did a clinic. He did some studies and submitted a paper to Australian Society of Gastroenterology. It was rejected. Then they sent a paper to Lancet. It was also rejected, but by some reason in the end it got published. And I remember his Nobel lecture. He said he had done the worst clinical trial. He had treated 100 patients with this Helicobacter and given the antibiotics. It didn't fit to any rules how to set up a clinical trial. But anyway, it showed that by using antibiotics you can treat ulcer. And so it took a very long time. I think it was a journalist and some lay people who contacted him to get treatment before it was accepted. And then they got the Nobel Prize 2005. So that's my introduction, and maybe I want to give, if you have any questions, of course, but otherwise I want to give the word to Sarah. We can switch slides. Any questions?
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about publishing and open access. And some of it will be relevant to you as researchers, and some of it will be a little bit more relevant if you work in any editorial teams of journals, and I think quite a lot of you do, so hopefully that'll be quite interesting. And I should probably apologise if any of it comes across as an ad for Wiley. It's just that I know more about Wiley's open access policies than I do about any other publisher's open access policies, so I will be talking more about Wiley's, obviously. So I'm Sarah Tatum George. I'm a senior journal publishing manager at Wiley. I look after our reproduction list, which is our OBGYN journals, our childhood paediatric journals, and also one andrology journal, which just has slipped in there. I've got a doctorate from Manchester. I taught there for 3 years while I was an associate editor of a journal before I moved to publishing in 2010, and then I moved to health science publishing in 2014. And I've led the journal's publishing team covering reproduction since 2021. And I'm publishing manager for Acta Paediatrica. So I'm going to talk about what open access is, why it's important, a little bit about the history of open access since 2000, talk about the different kinds of open access, different open access licenses, talk about what funders and libraries and researchers want from open access and what publishers are doing in response, concentrating on transformational agreements, which you may have heard of or used when you've been publishing your work open access, and then what journals, what editorial teams need to do to be successful in an open access landscape. So what's open access? I think the main principle behind open access is that the world's knowledge is more powerful when it's shared, and that publicly funded research should be freely available to the public. So these are what we call the pillars of open research. So open access, that if we remove the barriers to published research, this makes the research findings available to everyone, which really drives forward the pace and strength of global innovation. Open data. So sharing your data means that it's what we call fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And that means you can have other people can analyze your work and reuse it, reproduce it. And that makes your work more kind of accountable and helps researchers to build a reputation. And then open practices. So if you're going to have your research be open, you need the practices that made your research be open as well. So we support researchers with tools to facilitate collaboration and recognize them for the work with things like authoria. So why is it important? It's increasingly visible in the news. It's been grounded in shared declarations such as the Budapest Open Access Initiative, the Berlin Declaration 2003, and is supported by policy changes. By now there's over 1,000 open access policies in place globally. So open access has really come very far from the Budapest Open Access Initiative in 2001. And it's been, I think, in the COVID-19 epidemic, pandemic, one thing that a lot of publishers did was make all COVID research open. So it wasn't necessarily gold or green open access. We made it what we call bronze open access, which meant that anyone could at least read it. And it wasn't just Wiley. I think every large publisher did that, which really helped researchers. I'm not going to read all of this out because there's quite a lot, but this is, we say that the open access developments from 2000 fall into kind of 3 time periods. So between 2000 and 2008, that was when it was starting up. We've got in 2000, PubMed Central and Biomed Central are being launched, the first major OA initiatives and letters signed. And this was kind of the emerging policy landscape. And during this period, we saw governments and funders start to think about open access. Publishers started to experiment, launching hybrid open access on their subscription journals or founding their own open access journals. By around 2009, 2010, open access was becoming a lot more mainstream. More and more governments were focusing on the benefits of open and launching their own open access policies and mandates. But I think around 5 years ago, a lot of funding bodies and a lot of governments became keener to accelerate the process because they thought the pace of the transition was still quite slow. So in the last couple of years, we've really seen the pace of developments really pick up. Cancellation of subscription agreements, increasing number of transitional deals being signed, and there's the Plan S principles as well. This has kind of led to what we describe as an article-based economy. Once upon a time, a large chunk of library budgets was spent on subscriptions and on licenses to access academic journals. But library budgets are becoming more and more squeezed, which means funders are mandating open access. So traditional subscriptions are falling, which is obviously a problem for journals. Researchers also, now that a lot of journals are online and with things like Google and Google Scholar, people find research by Googling. They don't so much find research by every month getting a paper journal through the post and reading it cover to cover. So we describe this now as the article-based economy. I'm going to talk a little bit about types of open access. Now, you're probably all aware of at least gold and green, but you might not have heard of diamond or bronze. So gold's fully open. You pay an APC, someone pays the APC, and there's different levels of reuse depending on the license. Diamond, that's also sometimes called platinum. It's much the same as gold, except that usually it's in a journal that's fully sponsored by a funder or some kind of, sometimes it's a sponsorship by a company or a publisher even, so that the people publishing don't have to pay the APC. So green, authors self-archive a version of their paper, but it's not the final published version, which is still behind a paywall, at least immediately after being published. And then eventually, after an embargo period, it becomes free to access. And then bronze, and this is what at Wiley we've historically called free to access. So my Acta Paediatrica colleagues will know that sometimes they'll email and say, can we make this paper free? And what we do then is we make it free for sometimes a limited period of time, and then that paper is much more likely to get cited, it's much more visible, but it's still really, it's behind the paywall in that at any point we can put it back as subscription only, and people can't reuse it. There's no reuse rights to that. We also now often try to make them read-only, so they can't be downloaded or printed. So just a little bit more detail here. There's kind of 5 ways that we can differentiate between these 4 different types of open access. There's the definition, obviously, so you can see that the articles are all immediately freely accessed, but it depends whether they can be downloaded, it depends whether they can be freely reused, and that depends on the license that's used, and some of them don't have an APC. Just a little overview of the licenses that fully gold or diamond open access papers have. So there's the Creative Commons by attribution license, which is the most open of all the licenses, and that's recommended for the maximum dissemination and use of licensed materials. The only kind of stipulation is that credit must be granted to the original authors. So papers published under just a CC BY license can be reused by anyone. They can be reused for commercial purposes. They can be altered. Derivations of them can be published, translations. That it's completely open. Anyone can use it in any way they want. There's also CC BY NC, which is non-commercial, so you can use it in any way as long as it's not commercial use. And then the CC BY ND, which is no derivatives, so it can be used commercially, but it mustn't be changed in any way from the original paper. All these, you're still supposed to cite the original author. There's also an even more restrictive version that I haven't put up here, which is CC BY NC-ND, and that means you can't use it commercially and you can't change it in any way. So it's kind of like the second 2 combined.
Can I ask here, because our authors of Acta are met by this and they have to make a decision, and this people sometimes ask about, but most in Acta, almost every state, I send these requests to Elin. Most of our articles will be on the left, and they not.
So on the left, so CC BY ND. Yes. So yeah, sometimes I get requests through from our customer service that says, our customer service agents that says that an author's been contacted us because they've got a paper that has been funded by, say, Wellcome Trust or some other big funder that mandates CC BY instead of CC BY NC or CC BY ND. And in that case, I always say, yeah, that's fine. But as a rule, we prefer it to be non-derivative or non-commercial because, you know, we want to keep at least some control over the paper because that's in the journal's best interest. But, you know, we are kind of open to adjusting that if asked. So if you want something, and this goes for anything in life, if you want something, ask. Because if you get told no, it's not the end of the world. But nearly always, if you ask in a nice way, certainly if I'm the publisher, if you ask, I'll say yes. That might not go for other publishers. So what do funders and libraries want from open access? Every funder and every library is unique. They're at different levels of open access. They have variances in their spend with publishers, but there are some things that most of them really want. What they want is a predictable spend. They want it to be lower than it is last year or the year before, even though they still want subscription journals and open access. But that makes sense. There's a cost of living crisis. Budgets are being squeezed. Everyone wants more for less if they can get it. And we're aware of that, so what we want to do is offer more for less. They want the migration to open access to be as fast as possible, and they want the more access to content than they've had previously. They want the workflows to pay for open access or to have a license to publish open access to be as smooth as possible as well. And many funding bodies and governments want to mandate the least restrictive licensing, so they want CC BY. Though obviously some authors and some journals want to have it be a little bit more restrictive. What do authors and researchers want? Now you'll see that a lot of the little icons are the same, because a lot of what authors and researchers want are the same as what the libraries and the funders want. So researchers want free access to as much content as possible. They want to have workflows and processes which are really easy to handle when they're publishing, because there's nothing worse. And to be honest, even I work for a publisher, and sometimes I get queries and I'm like, I just do not know. And I have to go to our open access team for the answer. And I know that sometimes editorial office teams are the same. They don't know either. So what we aim to do is make it as smooth and as simple as possible, but it's not always that easy. What researchers want, they want increased reach. They want as many people as possible to read and cite their work, and that's where open access is especially appealing for authors. Authors or researchers probably want other authors to have as least restrictive licensing as possible, while at the same time maybe keeping on to a little bit of control to the licensing of their own papers. So there's that little bit of conflict. And then most of all, I think all authors, all researchers want the cost of OA to be as low to them personally as possible. So whether their APCs are covered by their institution, by funding, by transitional agreements with publishers, by waivers, it's difficult to afford to pay $2,000 or $3,000 or $4,000 or $6,000 out of your own pocket. And we understand that. So how are publishers responding? What's Wiley doing? So we know that open access is more and more popular. One thing we're doing is launching more and more new journals that are fully gold open access. We also transition journals to open access. We call it flipping. And that really depends on how ready a academic community, a research community is for flipping. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. We influence policy. We have a government affairs and open research team, which is really involved with national and international lobbying on behalf of our journals and our society partners as well. And then the thing that I'm going to talk about a little bit more now is we have more and more what are called transformational agreements. And the transformational comes in because what we're trying to do is, with the encouragement of funding bodies and governments, is transform the publishing world of everything being behind a subscription, everything being behind a paywall, to everything being open. So we have these agreements that are meant to assist with that, and what we're assisting is authors to publish open access. So a little overview of transformational agreements. It's an agreement where payment migrates from subscription access, i.e. reading, to the publishing APCs. So sometimes this is full and immediate, so we've got an agreement with Germany, with Project Deal, where anything in any of our open access journals is freely available, and there's no limits on it, and sometimes there's a capped budget of funds. So you might have found that your country has a transformational agreement, and if you apply in January, you get funds via your institution and this transformational agreement, and if you apply in September, they say there's no budget left for it. So I would say, if you have a paper that you want, if speed is not of the essence, and you have a transformational agreement between your institution or your country and a big publisher, try and publish it in January. I mean, that is really important because, you know, I think the deal we had with JISC ran out either June or July last year, and we have seen this quite a few times, that people who would have got funding for OA don't get it because unfortunately they've applied at the wrong time of the year. And it's not up to the publisher, this is up to their institution, whether or not they say yes, essentially. So more and more publishers, it's not just Wiley that has transformational agreements, Elsevier, Springer, TNF, Sage, CUP, OUP, all the big publishers have these transformational agreements. And you can see that the donut, as I believe we're calling it, Elsevier has nearly 30% of everything they publish covered by transformational agreements. With Wiley it's 20, Springer it's 19, and then all the others have far fewer. Over 3,000 articles per year now. 3,000, that wouldn't be a lot. 300,000 articles per year now are published worldwide under these transformational agreements. And there's 761 listed in ESAC. I'm just going to talk a little bit more about Wiley now. So this slide is called, and I didn't name it, Wiley Leading the Way with Open Access since 2011. So our first titles were launched, our first fully gold open access titles were launched in 2011. We had our first flips in 2012. Our first transformational agreement in 2016. We signed with Project Deal in 2019, JISC in 2020, and we bought Hindawi in 2021, which was a bit, now I'd say, if any of you have seen the news with the number of Hindawi journals that have been delisted from the Clarivate and the lost their impact factor, and several of them have had to close because of paper mills publishing special issues. So that's really expanded our open access reach, but I'd say it was probably a bit of a double-edged sword there for Wiley. At the start of 2023, we had more than 500 open access journals, over 300,000 open access articles published since 2011. 90 journals have flipped to open access from being hybrid, and we have 78 transformational agreements. So these are Wiley's transformational agreements. If it's green, it's covered by one of our transformational agreements. And last time I showed someone this slide, they pointed out that there is this band of grey of the low-income countries. So I do always now try and say that a lot of researchers based in countries in Africa, in Asia, and in South America are eligible for partial or full APC waivers via the Hinari Research for Life initiatives. So that's why they're greyed out. It's not that they don't have access to publishing open access in our journals, it's that they're not covered by our actual transformational agreements. There's two kinds of transformational agreements, and I think this is true of all publishers. We've got the ones that cover publication in gold journals and in hybrid journals, so this is the list of ours. And then moving on, we've got the ones that only cover publication in our hybrid journals. And we're signing fewer and fewer of these because more and more of the ones we're signing now cover publication in the fully gold journals as well. So that offers more choice to authors. Just to talk a little bit about waivers. So Wiley's partnered with Research for Life to offer full article publication charge waivers to authors from nearly 90 low-income countries, and authors from over 40 low and middle income countries are eligible for 50% waivers as well. There's also commissioning waivers, so our editors that have fully gold open access journals have a limited number of waivers that they can use to commission papers. And we often give a proportion of articles in special issues open access waivers as well. Because I do appreciate for editors of a gold journal, it's quite awkward sometimes. It's harder to do commissioning if you've got to ask someone to submit to your journal. Oh, and by the way, you've got to pay £2,000 for that. These are the ones we've got in the pipeline, so you see there's more and more. Not all countries are suitable for transformational agreements, and even if they are, we might have a 5-year deal to provide them with subscription access. So there's different expiry dates. They won't all happen at the same time, but we are doing our best to make sure more and more researchers are eligible to have their APCs covered. I think that these deals are only going to increase in number as time goes by, and as well as Wiley, every other publisher is trying to do the same thing. So it's going to be easier and easier to publish your research without there being a direct cost to you, or even a direct cost to your funding grants. What's it mean for paediatricians, essentially? What's it mean for your field? Well, open access content and funding has been going on year for the last 5 years. It's up to 41% in paediatrics. You'll see there's been what we call the post-COVID slump with the number of articles being published in 22. That's because so much was published in 21, people ran out of steam, I think. Essentially, similarly in Acta Paediatrica, so there's been quite a big jump in 2022 in the proportion of articles published as open access. So I think that looks like it's about 43%. It's getting close. I'd say in the next couple of years it's going to be 50% or so. So this little bit's going to be a little bit more relevant to you if you work on a journal as an editorial team member or as an editorial office person. Publishing strategies for editorial teams. Now these are publishing strategies for any editor of any journal. Essentially, these are the things you need to do to make your journal a success. You want to grow your output. You want to increase editorial board members from target countries. You want to increase special issues. You need to improve efficiency. You need the turnaround times to be faster. You need the peer review times to be faster. You need to improve your author satisfaction scores. You need to engage with open research, mandate ORCID IDs, have data sharing policies, experiment with transparent peer review, and you need to diversify your revenue. So you need to keep an eye on things like bronze open access. You need cover sales program, new article types to attract more papers. But I'd say the most important thing about this is growth. A shrinking journal is not a long-term viable prospect. Additional considerations for journals in the open access landscape. Again, grow your output because revenues have are directly proportional to the number of APC bearing articles that are published. Diversify your revenue, so make sure you've got non-subscription revenues as well. Carry on improving efficiency and engage with open research by thinking about flipping the journal to open access. That's kind of the next steps, I'd say, for most journals that are what we call hybrid, so publishing open access but largely behind a subscription paywall. Probably in the next 5 to 10 years, most hybrid journals will be at least thinking about flipping to fully gold open access. So if you're thinking of flipping, these are the criteria that need to be considered. You need to think about the editorial team and the editorial board attitudes. If the society that owns the journal, if the editor, if the editorial board aren't on board with open access, it's never going to be a success. The community needs to support it. So 41% of paediatrics content is currently published OA, so I'd say that probably there's a reasonably high community acceptance of OA in paediatrics. Content growth, again, submissions need to grow and output needs to grow as well. And article quality, timeliness of publication, you need to ensure that the content continues to be of high quality and well cited, and processes need to be smooth. Availability of funding, that's something you really need to take consideration of, and the geographical distribution of authors. So you need to look at this, because if it matches up with your publisher's transformational agreements, that means that probably you're going to be a lot more successful than if it doesn't. So, conclusions. Open access is here to stay. It's not going anywhere. Everyone needs to kind of really embrace that. The pace of change is rapidly accelerating. For instance, 2 years ago, Wiley had 10 TAs. Last year, we had 40. 2 months ago, we had 68. Now we have 78. Or rather, we have 78 when I wrote this presentation a couple of weeks ago. We probably got closer to 81 or 82 now. Most research will be openly available online within the next 10 years. So by that, I don't mean kind of research that was published 10 years ago will be available. I mean, in 10 years, nearly everything will be available when it's published online, open access. And journals need to make sure that they have strategies in place to remain viable in a fully open access publishing landscape. If you work out that to bring in the same amount of income as you're currently bringing in with subscriptions, you need to have an APC that's $8,000 because you're not publishing enough. That's not a viable journal in an open access landscape. So you need to make sure that you're publishing enough to bring in the same amount of subscription income, especially if you're a society-owned journal and the majority of this income is ploughed back into the community, because you won't have those funds to put on conferences, to give grants, to give prizes anymore. And researchers need to keep abreast of funding opportunities if they want their research to be widely read. So basically, to conclude, it's, get on board with open access or get run down. That's it. Does anyone have any questions?
So I guess my main brief this afternoon was to talk about style and language in the construction of an article. And that's essentially what I've kept to, at least for the first part. But I've broadened this out and taken a few side roads as well. So which I think will be interesting to explore. So I've divided this up into several parts, but the main script is this first one. So finding the right words. I'm Nick Brown. I'm the editor-in-chief of Archives of Disease in Childhood, with which some of you will be familiar. It's a BMJ journal. It comes in 3 parts. There's the main general blue journal, which currently has an impact factor of 4.9. There's a fetal and neonatal edition, which some of you will be familiar with, which has an impact factor of over 6 at the last count. And there's an education and training edition, EMP. My clinical base is in Gävle. I do my academic base is in Uppsala. My second home is in Pakistan, where I work as an epidemiologist primarily in Karachi. Before that, I worked in Bombay as an epidemiologist for several years. So my main academic throughput has been in international child health. So that's what I do. I've got no conflicts of interest. I'm not mentioning archives very much during this presentation at all. So this is, for some of you, this will be quite familiar. For those who are just getting going in with your writing, hopefully some of this will be useful. So I'm going to cover a few what I think consider as key components in the creation of a manuscript: the writing itself, critical methodology and critiquing, for which I've got a separate presentation, the creative process, and there's a session on abstract writing, which we'll see if we get to. There'll be some overlap in what Jonas was saying, but not very much. Great. So it never harms to be reminded what the key components of an abstract are. I'll come back to the abstract later and look at the rest of the paper, but we'll start with abstract and finish with abstract, because that is the key to unlocking an editor's interest and a reviewer's interest. So I get between 2,000 and 2,500 papers a year as new submissions, and I reject 50% at source. I don't send them out for review. I don't send them on to any colleagues for a second opinion. I reject, and normally make the rejection decision pretty quickly, within a few minutes, literally. I don't have time to revisit many papers. Occasionally I'm a bit on the fence and go back to it the following day, but most of my rejection decisions, 80-90%, are made pretty much straight away. And often as not, it's on the basis of a poorly written abstract, poor methodology, and often I know Jonas was saying that editors don't always take that much interest in the cover letter, but I do. I read every single cover letter because it gives me an indication of how much thought that the authors have put into the paper as a whole. The cover letter's sloppy, and by that I mean badly written, poor sentence construction, or that the absolute, almost irrevocable one for me is if it's addressed to the wrong journal. So it's been a copy and paste from a previous submission. It's goodbye. It would have to be pretty amazing for me to believe that they really cared about the paper that much if it's a copy and paste cover letter. And I normally make some slightly ironic suggestion about them. Should you decide to submit elsewhere, I suggest you address to the right journal next time. Something like that. But I'm sorry to disappoint on this occasion, and wish you every success, and so on and so on. So, a good abstract has the following clearly stated. What's the exposure outcome association in which you're interested? Most clinical science pieces, and I'm leaving the basic science exploratory approaches out of this, but most scientific papers are based on assessing the association between exposure and outcome. That's essentially what most of us do. So what's the hypothesis? What's the primary outcome? What's your main exposure? And which method, which study design is best suited to answer that? That should come through in the abstract and be very clear. I'm going to go through the other bits of the article as well as of the manuscript as well, but I'm then going to come back to the abstract and go through that in more detail. So that's well done. The rest will probably follow. The things that can't be changed once the study is finished is the methods on which the abstract depends. If the methods are badly done, you can't go back and change that. A discussion can be rewritten, and recouched, put in a new context, but the methods can't be redone. So in terms of introduction, my advice is to keep it fairly short. What's the context that led you to start with this study? What's the previous work that's led up to this? Is this completely new territory? Which of course most papers aren't, but some are. What isn't known? What is currently controversial? And I'd say about 250, 300 words, not being dogmatic about it, is about right. And about 5 of your total 25 references should be perhaps given over to the introductory bit, but not more than that. The methods, and for me this is the deal breaker for a lot of studies, the abstract and methods. If the methods are inappropriate, I will reject that paper straight away. And what do I look for in the methods? I look for the right design. Is it an RCT? Is it an observational study, case control cohort, cross-sectional? Is that the right study design for which to answer this question? Quite often I see papers where the authors don't actually know what study design it is. They often claim it's a cohort study when it's clearly not. It's cross-sectional or vice versa, and that doesn't make me warm to it, let's put it like that. Is the primary outcome stated, and how is it measured? And by how is it measured, the sort of detail I need is everything down to the equipment on which it was measured, whether there was an intra-observer variation assessed in studies involving human measurements, and those sorts of details. Because the bottom line is, someone else who's read the paper should be able to go and replicate that study in a group of other children and other participants, other patients somewhere else in the world, and do test how it works there. And so it's like a recipe. You should be easy to replicate. The measurements and validation I mentioned. Analysis, quite often see holes here, sometimes fixable, sometimes not. Sometimes it's clearly a sign that the authors just aren't that used to it or didn't have a statistician involved. Sometimes that can be fixed and sometimes not. Consent and ethical clearance and prerequisite really, particularly for trials. And the one mistake, totally avoidable mistake, which anyone doing a trial should know about, is register in advance. So the ICMJ, the International Committee for Medical Journal Editors, launched a new rule in 2007 about pre-recruitment registration, and nothing's really changed since then. And the reason for that is it's an insurance mechanism. It means that authors can't go back when they get some results through and change the primary outcome to one that suits them, makes the paper look a bit more attractive, because there's a positive result. I like negative results. I think they're just as important as positive results, as long as it's the truth. But if the and I'm very strict about that. To be fair to those who have done it the right way, if there's post-recruitment registration, even by a day, I feel duty bound to reject that, unless there's a very compelling reason not to. So in the results section, what do I like? So I like a primary outcome. That's what it's all based around, with an effect size. Most papers only need 3 tables: a descriptive or a risk of bias table. How do participants and non-participants differ from a generalizability point of view? Table 2, the univariates, your univariables, and table 3, the multivariables, the adjusted model. Most papers don't need a figure. Kaplan-Meier chart is quite nice, and for test validation, a Bland-Altman figure is necessary. But for most, the majority of papers, additional figures aren't actually necessary. So discussion is often the hardest part to write and read, and its main purpose is to put your findings in context. So I'd say about 500-600 words here, with the majority of the references going to this bit. But essentially, the discussion consists of the following. So we found, summarize your findings. How does this fit in with other studies? The strengths and the limitations, and be modest about this. So in terms of style and language, be concise, make your point, and move on to the next point without repetition. No ornate words, and you'll probably recognise, you'll have read papers where the language is a bit ostentatious. It's using unusual words to put an extra veneer on pieces. So one of my other common ones is lacunae in evidence. Lacunae means holes. It's an old Latin word. It's used quite a lot, and that doesn't make me warm to the paper. But there are lots. Another common mistake is to use over-emotive words like our incredibly interesting study, or we feel very strongly. Those sorts of things. They're for the reader to decide, not for the authors to decide. Punctuation, very common mistakes, and it's quite painful. I'll show you how you can get around that. And the best way of improving style is by reading. Read a couple of papers a day and judge for yourselves what was done well and what was not done well. Critique a couple a day. So ways of helping, or for authors to help themselves, for you to help yourself, is if it's an English journal, involve an English co-author or at least a colleague if they weren't directly involved in the scientific work and don't fulfill the requirements, the criteria to be a co-author. A lot of journals, and Sarah touched on this, use language services like editage, for example. And if there's any doubt, you can ask the journal to run the manuscript through that process. Get a second check reader colleague to check again. What always helps is to reread it yourself after you've had a few days away from it. So put it down, whether or not you've asked someone else. Have a break, because the last few stages of completing a manuscript are always hard work. You become very immersed in it. You stop seeing perspective, and we've all done this, and it's hard work. And you think you've got there, and then you press submit, and then you go back to it a few days later out of curiosity and see there were quite a lot of things you wish you'd actually just left for a few days, fermented for a few days, and then went back. I would never use Google Translate, because we know that about 80-90% of the time it's okay, and then about 10% of the time there's a complete curveball where you come out with something that's completely out of context. It's literally translated, and yeah. So those are things not to do, and this is as much to do with style and plausibility and robustness as language. Don't data dredge. So common mistake is to have a primary outcome, want it to be positive but turns out not to be. To me, that's absolutely fine, but then start presenting the secondary analyses from the abstract onward and focusing the discussion on the secondary analyses. So that's just not appropriate. You're just present what you found. They can be mentioned low down in the discussion, but they're basically a hypothesis generating ideas for a future paper. They should never become the main focus, but quite often that happens. Data dredging, of course, is making multiple comparisons, and we know that even where there is no association between a particular group of exposures and an outcome, if you compare enough pairs, you'll eventually get a p that is less than 0.05, and you will find one of those roughly for every 20 to 20 times you run an analysis. So that's randomness, and if you're doing multiple comparisons, you should make an adjustment for that. Like the most commonly used one is called the Bonferroni correction, but that's another thing. But just it's very obvious when multiple comparisons aren't adjusted for. And in trials or any studies where a sample size has been estimated, doing post hoc power calculations is always very easy to spot, because the numbers chosen are never the standard 80-90 for power and 0.05 for p-value, and they should of course be part of the trial registration if it's a trial. And don't exceed the word count. People get just a bit frustrated by that, let's say. Just in terms of particular phrases to avoid, this one, the one at the top there, is for me is the one that gets my pulse going most, actually. I don't know why, but it does. Don't say there's a trend towards significant, because in any comparison, half of the directions of it would be one way and half would be the other, trying to sort of infer causality from study that was in one direction or the other doesn't mean anything. It's so a trend towards significance to me is the single phrase that that's not a deal breaker, of course, but it's something I'd ask them to remove. I would be very careful about saying more studies are urgently needed. Again, it's for the reader to decide. It's one of these slightly emotionally manipulative phrases which is overused and become a bit tedious. And as I said before, don't use words like "is it an interesting finding" or "we were surprised" or that sort of thing. Just let the readers decide that. Let's go back now to the cover letter, the common mistakes in presentation. So it's slightly unclear why the study was undertaken, unclear what it adds, the findings might be overstated, and then the contribution of the authors with respect to ICMJE criteria. So we talked a bit about this earlier on, but I've become a bit hawk-like when it comes to multiple authors, and it's a common problem in multi-center trials, particularly where each centre, the contribution of most centres has been to identify some children, some participants, and flag them up and report them on some sort of standard format paper. To me, that's nowhere near what's required for ICMJE criteria for.
But you can have a little box with
Yes, that's. Yeah, as acknowledgements or as part of a group. So that's what I ask authors to do. But there's often quite a bit of resistance to that. They want to be on the front top line. That's yes. So yeah, common mistakes in the title. I think the title, a bit like the cover letter, is an underrated resource. So there's some, apart from being too long and exaggerated, you want a title that can be identified easily for someone searching. So here, Google's the most commonly used vehicle for searching. So not having something that's readily Googleable is a disadvantage. So you need some keywords. But there's quite a lot of evidence, despite people wanting to write in their own style, that this particular format, using the subject and then a colon and then study design, is the most citable. It gets more citations than other forms of title. So, for example, growth after cisplatin therapy for sarcoma, colon, secondary analysis of a randomized controlled trial. That will get you more citations than another way of describing that, on average. Don't know why, but there is actually literature on this. Is that what you're using in Acta, Hugo? We don't insist on it, but it's in the author instructions. We suggest using this format. We don't insist on it, but it's. That's what I used to think, but the analyses tell me that this is more citable, and I
was going to say my background is history, and historians have quite a tendency to try and put a joke in there somewhere.
Yeah.
And since I've worked in publishing, I've realised that isn't the way forward. You want to put just exactly what it says on the tin.
Exactly. With some keywords and something that Google will find as well, plus the other engines, obviously. So common mistakes with trials specifically. So late registration, we've talked about post hoc sample size calculation, and multiple not a priori staged secondary analyses. So even the secondary analyses should be all listed in the at registration, and everything should be on clinicaltrials.gov or an alternative, a national or continental registry, just somewhere that an editor can or a reader can check that Great, so common mistakes in presentation, carry on. Unclear hypothesis, wrong statistical model. So it's quite common errors, but sometimes these can be fixable. Non-standard tables and figures. Title we've talked about a bit, but other things, they should be catchy but easy to be released on found on Google and that sort of format. So I'll come back to the abstract now. Most readers will only read the abstract, and editors' decisions are very strongly influenced by the abstract. As I say, my screen is the cover letter, the title, the abstract, and methods. That takes me about 5 minutes for most papers, and I'll have made a decision with a few minutes after that once I've digested it, and 50% I reject. So if those bits are not compelling, the chances are slim. And most of this is pretty simple. It's follow the journal requirements. Most journals want structured abstracts, but not everyone, not all of them. Stick to the primary outcomes. Don't use those terms I've gone into. Don't overstate your findings. So I've got an example here of an abstract, a hypothetical one, and we can walk through it. So abstract, the background, the hypothesis, the methods, the results, and the context. So let's look at this. You're interested in, as authors or readers, exploring the association between malnutrition at 1 year of age and pneumonia incidence subsequently until school age in Mozambique. So there's your title, a cohort study. So what would I want from an abstract if I was reading this? This is the sort of thing that would interest me. I'd like some background context, so a sentence there. So something like the intro would be the launch sentence would be something like, nutritional rehabilitation has been shown to reduce all-cause mortality in deficient populations, but the effect on respiratory tract infection remains controversial. So in the methods, I'd like to know something about the following: was where this study, where you tested this hypothesis on a poor urban slum in Maputo, Mozambique. So the exposure, nutrition is slightly harder to measure, but there are several standard measures, which basically most of which in this age group use Z-scores. So weight for age, weight for height, height for age, Z-score. You choose, but that's your exposure. Information on confounders. And then you want to what is your outcome and how are you going to measure that? How are you going to measure episodes of pneumonia? Is it going to be by hospital admission? Many of these children will not be that unwell, so are you going to have household surveys? That's an alternative. You just need to say, how are you going to define pneumonia? There are standard WHO definitions, which are largely respiratory rates, plus a few other parameters, based and fairly simple. So our outcome was based on WHO defined non-severe fast breathing pneumonia brackets WHO 2014, and were identified by 2 weekly health worker household surveys, something like that. And then your outcome is going to be likely to be some way of quantifying the difference. A standard way would be doing an incident rate ratio between the exposed group, the undernourished group, and the controls, the better nourished group. Was there annual incidence of pneumonia greater than those in the controls? So, and suggestive of that would be an incidence rate ratio of greater than 1. Significance would be there if the confidence intervals didn't cross 1. And there are so it would likely to be a so-called Poisson model. But there are refinements to that as well, because there are issues like clustering with individual multiple episodes, but I won't go into that today. So that's the sort of thing I'd like in the abstract. There's the fully adjusted model of the incidence rate ratio, 3.1, so fairly convincing. So there seems to be an independent effect of undernutrition on pneumonia incidence in that setting. So what you say, this is an observational study, clearly not a trial. Malnutrition predicts, that's the way, one of the standard words used where you want to avoid implying causality in an observational study. You can say there's an association, it predicts pneumonia incidence in preschool children in urban Mozambique. And that's probably as far as you can take this. You've done your adjustment for confounding. So what do you think of this abstract? Just take a couple of minutes to read it. And then in one or two words. I think it's painful. I've read this several times and I still don't really understand it. So that's I mean the title is a bit long-winded and tedious, and it's very hard to know what they're actually doing or trying to do. So it's an that's why I chose this example. And there are no subheaders, so it's very hard to follow, and very dense text, and it's yeah. Great. Those are the sorts of things that I wanted to say largely about. I've just got a few to. Yeah, it'll be 5 minutes more, and then. So, other aspects to be sure you've tackled. So etiquette, as we mentioned before, is it adherent to the right guidelines? So the equator guidance, so consort for trials, Prisma for meta-analyses, Strobe for observational studies, and so on. Registration we've talked about. Analysis and presentation we've largely talked about. The tables and the discussion I think we've largely touched on. And conclusion, one sentence and stop. And don't say more than that. This study, anyone recognise this study?
Yes.
Well done. How many words? 600. 600 words. So any authors complaining that 2,500 isn't enough, just need to read that. Great. That was all I had for this one.
I want to introduce Ola Saugstad, who is professor in Oslo, and you're probably, most of you are familiar with him. He actually started his research career in Uppsala, and you know his fight against Oxtian, and he has published a book also, and our aim was to get this book and sell it in our booth, but by some reason it's lost somewhere, but I hope we'll get it tomorrow. Unfortunately, Ola is leaving tonight, but please.
Well, thank you very much, Hugo, for inviting me to this very interesting and important meeting for me. I'm quite new as editor-in-chief of Neonatology, so I learn a lot from Nick and from Hugo, who have much more experience than I have. What I will say now will be a little bit overlap, but I think that maybe that's some important aspects anyway. I'll talk about. So I first start out with the what you call what happens with a paper when it's submitted. So the manuscript is received, and if it's incomplete, it's sent back just by the editorial office without me even seeing it. But as also Nick and I think Hugo also said that Nick rejects 50% of his manuscripts right away. And well, I'm not so tough yet, so I don't reject that many right away. And yeah, I read a cover letter, but it shouldn't be too long because I can have to handle up to 10 manuscripts every day. So I have to make it I have to read fast, and I read the abstract, and then I go to the method. So I'll come back to that in a moment. So if you send a paper out to review, it's really a struggle, as was mentioned here, to get reviewers. I've tried up to 20 people and said declined or no response, and it takes a lot of time to get reviewers. Well, maybe I'm too tough because I reject totally 90% of the manuscript, and I'm a little bit tougher than my co-editor Christian Speer so far. So I had tried to find to adjust the right balance here. So if I get a manuscript back with, for instance, from 2 reviewers, one say reject and one say major revision, most often I will reject the paper. Of course, it's more difficult if one say reject and one say minor revision. That's more difficult. And then it's revised, and it could be rejected again, and then come back to the editor and finally accept or reject. So this is the workload, and this is from January 1st this year, 229 manuscript, and you see 146 rejected already, and only 47 accepted. Is around 20%. So here is illustrated a little bit differently. So at the top here you see the manuscript received per month. So it varies a lot, but it seems to be an increasing trend. And then we have the manuscripts rejected right away, the green line here, and then so this is rejected. Yeah, this is let's see now. See the colors. This is rejected before review, and here we have the accepted number. So it's approximately. You see, I started here, so I don't know. This dip is probably artificial, but it seems that we are at the same level as before, but I'm not sure I found my right level yet. So what I do when I receive a manuscript, I have some checkpoints, and you heard many of these points have been mentioned already. I recently got this cover letter. Dear Professor Romano, Editor-Chief of American Journal of Obstetric Gynecology. Yeah, I reject it right away. But then I'm a little bit softer than Nick, because the authors complained and said they were so sorry, and I was so soft. Okay, I said it's human to make mistakes, so you can resubmit it again. See what happens. I haven't received it yet. So, but of course that's quite annoying. You see that they haven't even paid attention to the cover letter. I mean, it's not a good start. And then I check what kind of study is it, prospective. I don't like retrospective studies. I mean, I reject them more easily than prospective studies. I check if there's been ethical approval, and I'd very recently received a clinical study from China where they wrote that ethical approval was not needed in this study, and I didn't agree, so I rejected the paper. So, and clinical studies should be registered. So if an RCT is not registered in clinicaltrials.gov or similar database, I reject the paper. I also always go into the protocol and check, and it's surprising how often I've seen that outcomes have been switched, and that is misconduct and maybe even fraud. For to, just as Nick also mentioned, to get a significant result. But it's not only that; it's also that sample size calculations are then wrong, so it destroys the whole paper. And I have to mention since Hugo said that we are competing journals, I don't consider us as competitors. I think we are working together in an important field, and I have to say that I'm very happy that I still am allowed to publish in Acta Paediatrica. And I have actually one paper in press, or actually it came out on PubMed now a few days ago, about searching for evidence in neonatology, where we bring up this problem with outcome switching, and also industry-funded studies.
And one paper.
Oh, yeah. Okay, already. Or that was another. So I had 2 recent papers in Acta. So I'm very happy, especially after I became editor of Neonatology. It's very good for me to still be able to publish in Acta and maybe also in archives, because I cannot publish as freely in Neonatology anymore. Also mentioned by Nick that systematic reviews should be registered in Prospero. So if there is a systematic review, I go directly to methods. So if it's not registered, I don't even read I read the conclusion abstract, but I don't consider such papers. I'm very strict. Should also follow the Prisma. And very recently I did a mistake, because I received a randomized controlled trial. I checked the protocol, and I checked the outcomes, and they were not changed. And I sent it out to review, and then I checked when did they start enrollment. And they started enrollment before they had registered the paper. And I should have seen it before I sent out a review, because there's no way to accept such a paper. It was rejected right away. So that's also misconduct. So that's very important. And for those of you who are reviewers, please check the protocol, because it's amazing how many are changing outcomes a little bit, or switching, or coming out with new outcomes, primary outcomes. Double publication has been mentioned, plagiarism, and in neonatology and also now in Acta, I don't know how it is in archives, but you have a plagiarism program. Yeah, so that's very useful, I think, for us as editors. And also, I think the conflict of interest is an important aspect, and I'll come back to that. So this is basically, this is from Journal Paediatrics recently, and it basically summarized the same items as I've been discussing now. And so you underlined here, duplicate, publication, salami, science, that they're splitting up a study into small pieces and publish a lot of studies from the same kind of database, and also duplicate publication, which it's not always so easy to identify. I had a paper recently from Africa about C-section and meconium aspiration. I sent it out to review. I had problems getting reviewers, so I checked at PubMed, and then I saw they had a similar the same author had a similar article already published without quoting. I sent them a letter, asked if they could kind of explain how much overlap it was between these two manuscripts, and I never got a reply. So I guess that this paper will be retracted. Yeah, here you see that fatal ethical issues, lack of informed consent, etc. Ghostwriting has been mentioned, and I also mentioned ghost authors. I was offered recently $2,000 if I would include a guy as a co-author. I don't think any editorial editors could kind of detect that. I don't know. So I could become a rich man if I publish 10 or 20 papers a year. So, I found that this such serious. So I reported it right away to the dean of faculty, and I don't know if any one of you have the same experience. Yeah, ethical issues, research misconduct, mentioned outcome switching, which I think should be taken seriously. Plagiarism mentioned, duplicate publication, and also authorship and open access abuse. We heard a lot about open access already. Yeah, so why do ethical transgression occurs? Many reasons for that, of course. Desire to distribute the findings, lack of accountability. People don't understand maybe that it's wrong, and I think that if you do a mistake, for instance, if you're switching outcome, and if you don't understand that this is wrong, well, it's human to make mistakes, but if you do a mistake, you should try to correct it. You should just apologize. You should send in an errata, and this is also what is required. And in some cases, articles should be retracted, but at least you should acknowledge and try to correct it. I would like to hear from Hugo and Nick if you think that such papers should be retracted or not when it's discovered afterwards, because many reviewers don't check the original protocol.
But the author has to retract the papers, so it's very difficult to retract the papers. It's not so easy. And we have this case of Macchiarini,
Yeah.
who at Karolinska made some operation of trachea and then patients died. And
Yes.
it took a very long time before Lancet retracted the paper.
I thought the editor could decide that. Yeah.
No, I mean, if it's something like that, they don't have to accept it. We have to tell them about it, and then we retract it, and even if they complain about it, you can't kill people.
There was a couple of chloroquine papers which were retracted now during the COVID. I thought it was the editors who had retracted, but
I think what usually happens, I think, is the editor starts the process, but I would always do it in combination with publishing.
Yeah, it's like the publishing team.
Exactly.
They'll have an ethical team,
Yes.
yeah.
and that it can take a very long time, because usually you have to go to the institution. No, Hugo's laughing because we've just taken forever to do something.
Yeah, the Norwegian paper.
Yeah.
That's best. This Norwegian paper about shaken baby syndrome.
Yeah.
That was required.
In Acta. The one in Acta. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the people in Oslo wanted that retracted.
Yeah, yeah. There's been a big discussion about shaken baby syndrome in Acta now. Yes.
There is an alternative, which is, I don't know what the name is. It's called a mega revision, which I used once on a paper that was very flawed, but there was no fraudulent intent here. It was just sloppily done, but it was quite misleading in a very controversial area. And there was some literature in JAMA about using that rather than retraction, which is quite a severe step. So that's what your authors seek for this, their lives, essentially. But this was extent was had a sorry. I don't think it's working now. This is better. So we eventually decided that was the right level of punishment, I guess, and it went for a complete re-review, and then I published an editorial to go with it, which was linked, saying where we had concerns, where concerns had been raised, what the authors had done to. So it came with a label, but we ran with it in the end, and it was partly. In my defence, it preceded me. I inherited this one. I think that was a fair decision.
Yeah. So a resubmission is not that uncommon, I guess.
Oh, that's the norm. But this was called a mega revision, which came with a commentary. I think that was fair.
Academic pressure to publish, and of course, talking about outcome switching, it's not only that you are kind of changing your outcome, but scientific publication also promote your career. So you get a career on a kind of false grounds. So this Office of Research Integrity is. I guess it's possible to contact them if you have any questions or queries. So this is just a definition of research misconduct, unethical treatment of research subjects, purposeful manipulation of the scientific record such that it no longer reflects observed truth, fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism in proposing, performing, or reviewing research, or in reporting research results. This was an article in JAMA Surgery about open access. I think we have discussed some of the challenges with open access already. This is just an example. Very recent, as I'm sure many of you remember, that this hydrochloroquine study was retracted. There's also the so-called retraction watch. You can consult to see which papers have been retracted. And then just to finish, a few words about conflict of interest. This is a definition by Louis First, from editor of Paediatrics. This is the ICMGA definition, but I have it from a seminar we attended, some of us at the PS meeting recently. So that is when professional judgment concerning a primary interest, such as patient welfare or the validity of research, may be influenced by a secondary interest, such as financial gain. Perceptions of conflict of interest are as important as actual conflicts of interest. So a conflict of interest can exist whether or not the author believes that relationship affects scientific judgment. Example, personal relationships or rivalries. Well, we know in academics a lot of personal rivalries, and so the question is, of course, how much will a personal conflict? How much will that count as a conflict of interest? And it's not always so easy. Recently I had to ask Hugo about that. And I think it's good, if you are in doubt, you should you can ask the editor about that. Academic competition, for instance. Yeah, so here are some, again, criteria for conflict of interest: financial and also non-financial, unpaid personal or professional roles with organizations, unpaid advisory role, unpaid expert witness testimony. So I think that was basically what I want to say, Hugo. That was 20 minutes. Yeah.
Great. So a little bit on critical appraisal. I'm going to do this fairly quickly because there's quite a lot of overlap between this and the actual writing section. So, how many of you do review regularly? Most, yeah, about half. So you'll be familiar with this. And if you're new to it, it's quite daunting. It's quite scary. You know, you think, I'm not going to be able to condense this and get my thoughts together, but it's actually pretty straightforward when you disentangle all the component parts, and it's easy enough to learn using a framework. And as most medical literature anyways is assessing the association between an exposure and an outcome, it's when you really take everything else away, all the noise away, it's fairly straightforward. So threats to a paper, we've talked about this from a writing point of view, but they're the same from a critiquing point of view. So things that would make a reviewer doubtful would be a badly defined research question, the wrong population, poor internal validity, and uncertain external validity. And I'll talk a bit about these. So, are you familiar with these terms? So, internal validity is the quantification of how close to the truth your findings are within the population you studied. So, how well do they represent what you actually did, what the reality is? And you can have studies which have got very high internal validity, but might not have external validity. External validity means generalizability. So an example I use quite often is 20 years ago there was a lot of debate about in maternal to fetal and neonatal transmission of HIV. It was in the early days of antiretroviral therapy, and the early studies from high-income countries showed that it worked very well. It reduced in chance of probability of transmission by about 95%, something like that. Then the issue was whether that was generalizable to low-income countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, where the main global burden of HIV was and still is, or whether that needed new trials because the population there was different nutritionally, immunologically, and for lots of other reasons. And so the trials that were done in the high-income countries were of high quality. There was no doubting their internal validity, but were they externally valid? And that was the big question. So that's an example of internal and external validity. So something else taken to the critiquing breakdown. So, but essentially, this is the slide to take with you if you're doing reviews. So, in a nutshell, the hypothesis in question, are they good? Do you know what they are actually asking here? Is the population the right one? Is there decent internal validity? In other words, are the methods good? So it's a composite of methods, and then addressing bias, confounding, and chance, and an appropriate analysis. And then external validity. And I don't really mind that much about external validity if the findings are interesting and thought-provoking, as long as it's well done. I'm interested in almost any study as long as it's done well. My rejections are almost always on studies where 90% will be on the basis of novelty or methodology. It's rare that there's anything else. Even wrongly addressed letters I can give a chance if there's although the chances of them getting in are great. So I'm not going to go into hierarchy of studies because I want to get onto other things today. But if you had to choose between two studies which are asking the same question, and one is done, the question in one is answered by a trial, and the other is from a cross-sectional study, then you'd go for the trial any day, as long as they're both internally valid, because it's a stronger design, simply. So population, we've talked about this briefly. So is it appropriate? Is the disease prevalence? Look. That depends on the context of the question you're asking. So a right population will be one that you might be able to generalize from, where there's sufficient disease prevalence, where it's ethically and culturally appropriate to ask the question, and those sorts of things. And it's not a population in terms of ethnicity particularly. It could be age group. It could be yeah. But it's a very broad term. But it's so sorry I didn't. And we've talked about the HIV. So internal validity. How closely do the findings from the study represent the reality in that population? So it's a composite marker of how well it's done. Essentially, that's what it means. So the method's right. Yeah. So in the methods, this is just as an example, and we talked about level of detail as a writer earlier on. So this is sort of, I'd ask the same of authors if I'm reviewing. So if I'm looking at a new drug, let's say this is a new antibacterial that's allegedly got an effect against MTB, so tuberculosis in children. What do I want to know about the exposure which is being tested in this new trial? I don't just need to know if they were given the drug or not. The sort of detail I'd need to know is dosage, frequency, route of administration, and duration. And then for some illnesses, it's relatively easy to define an endpoint. Something either happens or doesn't happen, but it's not always that easy. How do you define cure from TB? Much harder. Is it on the basis of symptoms, on the basis of fever settling, on the basis of weight gain? Much more difficult. So it's hard enough to prove in the first place, microbiologically, especially in children. How do you know when a child is better? So but those sorts of things I would expect the authors to have addressed. Bias, problem everywhere. Sometimes avoidable, sometimes not. So this is systematic deviation from the truth. In other words, something has happened along the way to distort the analysis you ultimately end up doing, either in selection of participants, in loss to follow-up rates, in some sort of internal observer bias where they might favor one group in terms of assessment over the other. And then, of course, in terms of publication, one useful way of looking at it is it's a form of confounding that can't be adjusted for, which is quite a nice way of looking at it. And it's not always possible to completely eliminate it, even in trials, because there might be differences in compliance. One of the two, if there's a drug trial, one of the two groups might have a particularly bad tasting medicine, which so compliance is lower, and very difficult to adjust for that. And then in participation, that's possible. So take this as an example in terms of participant bias. So you've got this, you're very interested in population serum lipid levels and prevention of long-term arterial disease. And you've got some observational data suggesting that regular exercise in school time, so 3 or 4 times a week for an hour, has a favourable effect on lipid profile. And you have no trouble getting it's going to be a randomised control trial, good design, and you have no trouble getting the number of participants. You go into schools and you have lots of keen volunteers. And then do some baseline analysis and find that the mean BMI of the participants, the volunteers, is 20. So what else do you need to know before you start on the study? You've got lots of volunteers, you've got enough to do an RCT. Some will be allocated to the exercise program, some will have normal games and no extra exercise. What does that BMI suggest you might need to be careful about? It's sort of healthy, and so
I mean, the low side of health is 18.
sure, yeah, well, we can say 22 then. I intended it to be a health, but the point, no, but well, you're right. The point, you're quite right though. It's but let's say that's a healthy BMI, and so the point is that if you randomize this group who already are who already are quite well, healthy, the effect of the exercise program is likely to be lower than if you took the whole population. So you really want a risk of bias assessment. What do the non-participants look like? They might all be the same, it's just the others just don't want to do it. That's okay. But if you might find you've selected a biased population. And in that case, or in this instance, that will bias your results to the null, so-called null. You're less likely to show an effect because this group, they're already fit, and the extra exercise, they all go home and run every evening in any case. So an extra hour at school isn't much extra for them, whereas it would be. So it would lose internal validity on the basis of selection bias or participant bias. So difficult, and publication I'm not going to go into. Some of you will be familiar with these with the funnel plot approach to publication bias. So there are statistical ways you can not eliminate it, but get it into some sort of perspective. But it's not perfect. Traditionally, journal editors have favoured studies which show something rather than those that show no effect, even though I think they're just as important, if not more important. But that's human nature to want to show something. Great. And have they addressed bias and chance and confounding? So this character was told by his doctor, who just read an article, if you don't cut back on cigarettes, your liver will pack in. Obviously, picked up the wrong end of the thread here because the confounder there is alcohol. So have the authors done that? Have they addressed confounders, so third factors associated with both exposure under question and the outcome, which distorts the relationship? And it's a big problem, or it's something that has to be addressed in all observational studies, and there are lots of different ways of doing it. I won't go into those today. Starting from restrictive selection to multivariable modelling to propensity score matching, lots of different ways. But even randomized trials don't completely eliminate confounding, because you can get issues like compliance, differential compliance, and so on. And I won't go into ways of addressing that because that's a bit too much. Great. So have they done that? As a reviewer, are you satisfied that they've at least addressed that? Chance, we talked a bit about multiple testing earlier on. The more you test, the more likely you are to find a positive finding. And the need to adjust if you're doing multiple testing, which risks that. So in other words, to do a correction, to undertake a correction. And worth remembering that a p-value of less than 0.05 even in an adjusted model, might be statistically significant, but it doesn't mean it's clinically significant. So that's so let's say you're testing a new type of growth hormone treatment, and you find a difference of 0.5 centimeters, so a Z-score of 0.05, something like that, at 18 years of age. The treatment's quite expensive, but you have shown without any doubt that it's statistically, there's a statistical difference of 0.5 centimeters. Is that clinically worthwhile? Probably not. So they're often confused, and perspective is needed. Great. That's pretty much all I was going to do. Just wind up with a few final slides. But they're the most important ones. Power, as a sample size adequate to demonstrate an effect if there is one. So the p-value reflects the alpha, the possibility of having a positive result where in reality there's no difference. The power is a reflection of the beta, a type 2 error, which is the probability of not showing a difference where there actually is one. And they're both used in combination in sample size equations. Of course.
I'm not aware that there are good reasons to talk about trends towards or something.
Yeah.
But I also sometimes think that people are really blinded by this 005.
They are.
I mean, really, I think it's also might also be interesting to see that. I mean, if the p-value is 007, I mean, it's not, then I mean until 93% or 95. I think some people are really blinded that, like it's some kind of a holy thing. I mean, of course,
I totally agree.
I mean, often, of course, a p-value of 0.02 or 1 is generally better than, of course, in the risk of some difference by chance. But I mean, it's still, I still sometimes have argues with people. I mean, a p-value of 0.07 is different from a p-value of 0.20 generally. I mean, or you can say, but by 93%.
Yes.
So I mean, that I think that definition might be sometimes. I agree with you that I mean, the trends towards something might be good, but sometimes if the study is a little bit underpowered, and of course that's a problem by itself. But also, I think you have to really look at a little bit more than just p-values.
I totally agree. It's an arbitrary value that somewhere along the line, probably many decades ago, just stuck, and it could have been anything. So I guess my issue with the trends towards significance is its misuse of the word trend, which means something that's continual, and it's just overselling something. They just stated the fact that we did not find significance, but confidence intervals suggest that with more participants, something like that.
We have a paper from Finland now, and the author claims that we should not use p-values any longer, only confidence intervals. And we have also a commentary by our statistician.
Yeah, I mean, I prefer confidence intervals in an effect size, but I don't think p can. It's too early to make that step, I think.
I agree.
Little bit about etiquette when you're judging a paper. We're talking about sample size. Have they done that properly? Ethical clearance. For trials, it's absolutely, there's no doubt about it. For any study, observational, including observational, if you're doing anything that might be considered more than standard treatments, like taking extra blood samples or measurements, should be ethical clearance needs to be sought there, and where consent is needed, it has to be fully informed. We talked a bit about guideline adherence before: CONSORT, MOOSE, STRO, PRISMA, CORE-Q for qualitative studies, and so on. And the analysis. are the statistical methods right? Sometimes there's more than one way of doing the analysis, but that has to be justified. Is a discussion relevant? Are the findings about right? Are they placed in context or exaggerated? And are the conclusions right? And that's what you need. That's how to do how to write a review using those component parts. And the more you do, the easier it becomes, and probably the more fun it becomes, actually. So I end with quite a light talk about just talking through the process of going from the very first idea to getting published. And it's a completely made-up hypothetical example, which kind of brings together everything we've been talking about over the afternoon, or a lot of it anyway. And we're just going to fly through these slides, and it's even if you've published many times, it's still quite useful to run through the process. So we publish because, well, different reasons, but altruism, sharing ideas, advancing science, and then there's often an element of academic kudos or need to do it for degrees or whatever advancement at an individual level. Not everything has to land in the New England Journal. Nice if it does, but so the essentials, I would say, are not essentials, but very important, and have decision influencing characteristics. Would be novelty, clear hypothesis which you don't stray from, one question, one outcome, and one answer. So no data dredging, no multiple secondary analyses, at least not in the primary paper. Generalizability, so external validity, and then modesty, awareness of limitations as well as strengths. So this is I've had this idea, so this is what this is based on. An idea you have. This is written more from a junior doctor's perspective, but the idea, where did the ideas come from? Well, a chance lab finding. You've noticed a series of clinical associations, a drug side effect perhaps, or previously unreported associations in a geographical area. So I don't know if any of you remember the Mediterranean diet theory, which was very interesting in adults who lived around the coast of the Mediterranean, Middelhavet. There seemed to be a lower incidence of coronary artery disease, and that for 5-10 years or so, maybe 15-20 years ago, generated a lot of interest, because it was known that in that area people ate a lot more olive oil, amongst other things. And anyone know what the problem ultimately with that sort of not a problem, but the epidemiological issues with that sort of observation are? It was very good for hypothesis generating. The problem is that partly it was that it's the main problem that it's an ecological study. So you don't have any individual level data. You don't know whether the people who got ischemic heart disease actually ate less olive oil or the opposite. You just know that over that whole region, that was the case. So that's so-called ecological fallacy, but it's still good for generating hypotheses. Ultimately, this didn't lead very far, but it took a few years. It was an area worth exploring. So the example I've got is based on this is from a junior doctor's point of view, essentially. But you've got a large series of children who've had abdominal surgery. You're working as an artillery, and you've got robust, good inpatient data. You know how long they stayed in, and you've just noticed, looking through the last year of records, that there's a difference between groups of children who've had laparotomy, abdominal surgery, in terms of their analgesia requirement, and time to discharge, and you're interested in why. They should all be about the same. So you look into it a bit more, and you find an association, or what you think is an association between early physiotherapy and mobilization ordered by their surgeons, and reduced analgesia and requirements and earlier discharge. And those that have mobilized early, so that it's the ones who have been asked to get up, walk around, and so on, seem to have earlier discharge. And you find a mean difference in time to discharge of nearly 2 days. Confidence intervals that don't cross naught, so significant at our traditional p-value, whatever that means, and lower pain scores, which you've assessed by a non-parametric measure. So that's interesting. There could, of course, be a lot of confounding. So what do you do next? Well, you do a Medlines search and use the usual portals, and this seems quite new, and you want to share this data. So what do you do next? Well, you can start with a retrospective analysis. You've got decent data, so you define early mobilization and pain scores, and you sort of test this a little bit more. Are the data sufficiently complete? And using these data, you generate a hypothesis. It's your own hypothesis generating data. So you do that, and you find that you go back 5 years, and yeah, this seems to be the case, that there really is a difference. You don't know why. So you decide to do this prospectively. In other words, you run a cohort study. This isn't at the level where you'd get funding or endorsement for a trial yet, but you look at, so you collect the data prospectively. You have a group which is early mobilized, and you need to define that. Is it physiotherapists get them up at less than 24 hours, and late is greater than 24 hours? That's up to you. And then prospectively, you collect information on confounders. You check that their time to discharge criteria are consistent, and you run this. And this, if it proves to be in the similar direction of effect, there might really be something here. And the final step, of course, would be a trial. So the writing. And again, coming back to these same points, but I wanted to do it in the context of your own writing. So a clear background, hypothesis, why did you look at this particular area, how did you come to the analysis, what other literature's out there, and the methods. Well, we ran a cohort study with exposure of early mobilization against standard of delayed mobilization after 24 hours, and you include some summary data, and you check, and as you're a regular journal reader, you'll have some idea of the writing process. You've discussed it, and you're then pretty happy with it. So you found that this difference is still there. There's odds or relative risk, depending on which way you want to measure it, suggest that early mobilization has an association or predicts early discharge, which of course is good for the children, it's good for their parents, it's good for ward turnover. It's a no-lose situation if this is actually the case. So then you have to choose the journal, and we've sort of touched on these guys earlier on, the predatory journals. Usually quite easy to spot because their approach letters are so all put-offs. They are. And you don't find them on Medline. That's another. But there are ways they can sneak under the radar, and they're just not places you want to go anywhere near. But there are other factors, apart from avoiding predators. There are other factors which Hugo mentioned earlier on. What is a correct journal? Do you go in a specialty area which covers all age groups, or do you go to a paediatric journal, which will ultimately have the right audience? Might be lower impact factor, but will probably have the more appropriate audience. That's not for me to say, but that's a decision that authors need to make. And I know what my advice would be every time, but you can draw your own conclusions on that. There's a useful, I think there are several sites, but the one I'm familiar with, which helps you choose journals, it's called Jane, JANE.com, and that helps you select keywords and just put them into this generic form, and then you put in 3 or 4 keywords, and then you'll get a list of journals where that combination of subjects has been published quite recently, and it's very helpful in helping hone your search. And I haven't used any others, but the idea is a good one. And you're not committed in any way, it just gives you a clue. If you don't know the literature, if you're well read and well versed, and you've got well versed colleagues who have helped, then you won't need anything like this. But it's worth knowing about. And the other suggestion to make is, if you've got an idea and you think you've got the right journal, email the editor. I get mails about twice a week. And just say, we're interested in this, is it worth sending to archives, to Acta, or is this not, is it better sending somewhere else first? We don't want to waste your time. And I quite like being approached like that. I give an answer, and if I think the idea is good in principle, I say, yeah, I think this is a nice idea. But obviously everything beyond this is peer review dependent, submit through the usual system. So there's no commitment on either side. I think it works quite well. Great. So know the scope of the journal, contact the editor, know the readership, do your reading really. That's the best way of knowing whether a journal. And if you don't, discuss with colleagues. Open access, Sarah talked about earlier on. One thing that has come up, a conspiracy theory I've heard is that the waiver scheme may not work as well as is intended to, because there may be a reluctance on the part of journals to publish if they're not getting a fee. Now, I don't know there's any substance to that, but I just thought I'd flag it.
So, editors in Wiley journals shouldn't be able to see if an author... Oh, thank you. Do I have to switch it on?
It's on.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, so editors of Wiley journals shouldn't be able to see whether or not an author has paid an APC, has selected open access if it's a hybrid journal, or if they have a waiver. I mean, you can get round it because, if you know someone's come from, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a country that has a waiver at the moment, say Nepal. Nepal has waivers at the moment. Then if you look and you see that the author's from Nepal, then you know that they're going to get a waiver. But to be honest, my editors mean that means they're more enthusiastic rather than less. In fact, I'm well aware and don't discourage my editorial teams talking to a group of authors and telling them who to select from their author list to get the best deal. Because as far as I'm concerned, I want to help people publish, not hinder them. And that's what my editors want as well.
I agree.
I'm not vouching for predatory journals, though. I'm sure that some really dodgy journals do that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Thanks. So, usual rules, but whether you're writing or reviewing, these are the key things. That's the slide to follow. You just stick to the question, and yeah. So maximising chances. Yeah, a good cover letter is important. Why you did it, why it's important, modesty, addressed correctly, and so on. And follow the journal instructions. If it says 2,500 words for an original article, then don't send 3,500 words. Most of the time, those will get picked up by the editorial production assistant at that stage and get sent back. I'm sort of okay to give 500 words above without them having to be sent back, but not more than that, because it's unfair on other authors. If you're letting some slip through, and follow other instructions, a standard number of figures, references, and so on. Yeah. So in predatory world, I don't want to talk about too much, but we all get approaches by these every day. I probably get 5 a day, and it's always got something like this. This is a very typical predatory approach. You'll be familiar. Warmest greetings, and yeah. So I don't even need to. Yeah. They always want something from you. Primarily the fee. Great. So Medline, if these journals are on Medline, pretty sure you can be. It's safe. PubMed, there are loopholes, and I don't know if you were, but it doesn't guarantee non-predatory status. I think. Just to
add to that, though, if it's a very new journal and
yeah,
it's not
sure.
Medline, then that's not necessarily a danger sign. I mean, it might still be a predatory journal, but if it's only 1 year or 2 years old and has only published 20 articles so far, it's not eligible for Medline yet?
Yeah, sure. But if it's older than that and it's still not got there, that's a flag. Yeah. Okay, so you submit your manuscript, early mobilization and post-operative outcomes, a cohort study, to a Medline Index journal, and a month later you get this from the editor. Thank you for your submission. Read your paper with interest. That's always good. And have feedback from peer reviewers. We invite you to respond to both the reviewer and editor's comments and modify the manuscript accordingly, but make no promises of ultimate acceptance. We felt the title could better represent the content. Yeah, that's not bad. Anyway, it's just an example. So you get what's usually called major revision, which is good. Actually, it means it's past stage 1. Major revision isn't a bad thing. It means that the journal wants to give you a chance to get it right. So responding to reviewers. This should be prospective charts. So sorry, that's a type. The main flaw of this review is addressing residual confounding. So an issue in a prospective study as well. I can't see that the strobe tool has been used. So these are reviewer comments. So what do? You're a bit tired. You've just been on call, and for some reason it just gets you a bit. And the best thing to do is not respond immediately. You go home, drink some chai, have a day off, and then you come back to it and you're fresh, and it's less personally. It feels less personal then. One definite bit of advice is never to react immediately to anything, even if it seems completely unnecessarily aggressive. Always step back for a little bit. And so another review: why was normally distributed data assumed? This makes assumptions not apparently justified by the data. And then you say, yes, you're right, the outcomes were non-linearly distributed, and we agree better represented as events. We've therefore reanalyzed using a proportional hazards approach. We've now included the relevant equator checklist. Bad answer. So another reviewer says the 2007 meta-analysis on endogenous opioids during physical activity was not cited in your introduction. You don't say, the reviewer does not appear to know the subject area. This paper has long been considered erroneous, and we do not want to introduce flawed studies into our manuscript. Even if that's what you want to say, you say, thank you for this suggestion. We've discussed this amongst ourselves. And as this study has been criticized on several levels, we felt it better not to get drawn into this particular argument, or something like that. But answer it politely. That's why it's always good to take a break. So
that's the problem. I mean, the easiest way we would just do it.
I know.
Just, although I don't
Sure.
disagree.
Sure.
What do you think about that?
I think it depends on exactly what the situation is. But if it's something where you really do feel strongly about it, then you stick to your guns. And you say, we respectfully disagree with the reviewer because of the criticism the paper has received. We will leave it up to the editor to decide. Our group would prefer it not to be in, but we leave it up to the editor to decide. We have not included it in this version. That's okay. Yeah. And then you get the paper, you have some cake. Other obstacles you might encounter, better to sort in advance. Förebygga snarare än bota senare. Author order, that can create problems. Some journals, if it's from a lower middle income country, prefer a local author first. Do all authors fulfill the ICMJE criteria? Are all authors in agreement about content? Well, they should have signed something to say they are. And post-publication, so you now got something, let's say, in the Lancet. What next? More chai? Yeah, but the next big hurdle, and this has become the big talking point, is actual implementation. And so your responsibility is definitely to present the truth, your findings. Whose responsibility is it then to change guidelines? So guideline change on the basis of this would be physiotherapists have to get to post-surgical children early on day one. Whose responsibility is it to run with that? Is it the authors? Is it the national body for surgeons? Someone has to take responsibility because it makes a difference. But this is where things often get stuck at the implementation. And that's all I was going to say. I'll mail the abstract.